I forgot the obligatory, can you hear me now? Everyone, I think it should be working now. I have a new setup. And
check.
We'll wait 1 second to see if anybody can hear. Can anybody hear now? Any sound now? Obligatory, can you hear me now? Everyone, working now.
I can hear it.
Okay, I think it's just, it was just delayed for us. All right, great. Thanks for everybody being patient. I will do this intro one more time. So
third
welcome.
time's the charm, man.
Third time's the charm. This is the third time we've done it.
Yeah, it'll be even better now.
Yes. So I'm Tom Mason, as you probably know. Welcome to my Hangout. And today I am hanging out with my new best friend, Matt.
Howdy.
Matt of Savage the Shard of Gosen fame. And soon to be, someday to be, Lord Breaker.
Yeah. Fingers crossed.
Yep. And Tom Mason, someday of the Goblin Menace. So thanks for jumping on, everybody. I have part of the new setup. I do have. It's much easier for me to look and see the chat. In the future, I've got a couple ideas to hopefully get the audio a little better, but at least everyone can hear. So I'm just going to be sculpting while we all watch, and Matt will as well. And if you have questions about sculpting or anything like that for me or Matt,
no, none for me, please.
Oh, okay. Save the questions for me.
No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, because I don't know what I'm doing, so I'm, piggybacking.
If there are if there's lulls in questions, then I have a nice stack of. Whoops! I just dropped some comment questions that I'm excited to answer as well. All right.
Very, very good. Case in point, I'm mixing up some white and black Fimo, and I totally forgot that the guy I was working on is not in. It's gonna look.
You can really do multi-tone.
Yeah, it's gonna look really. It's gonna confuse me as I start building it up more.
Yeah, I've known some folks who just grabbed whatever color they had, and it was sometimes intentionally, sometimes because it's just all they had.
Sure. Yeah.
It messes with my head, that's for sure. Seeing all those colors because it kind of turns it into a camouflage effect.
Right.
But at least it's still gray. It's not like you got.
No, and he's relatively thin right now, and I'm gonna bulk him up anyway.
Yeah.
So he'll probably get covered.
So I'm continuing on this heavy knight character that I started forever ago. I'm just gonna hopefully get him skinned the rest of the way during this stream, just so that next time I mess around with it, I can actually start working on some details.
Yeah, cool.
All right, so as I'm doing this, I will go ahead and read some questions. At least one of them. So we'll start with this one. Is that on the screen? Yes, perfect. Okay. So this question comes from Apostolos Raulias 8. Sorry about the pronunciation. Here's the question. It's always challenging reading these screen names. Yeah. Did you make any changes in your process to make printing and support removal easier? The way I see the model, I would print it head down. So this question, to give some context, is from my last video where I was sculpting the Farmer Gamut figure, and I did that digitally. So this person's referencing the 3D printing process. Now, goes ahead and answers their own question here. Just saw the short about this. Okay, not how I would print, but it turned out nice. And the final painted result looks awesome. So thank you for that. And I obviously you have the answer to your question, but I did want to comment on it that I am not a 3D printer. I do the very basic stuff, don't print it flat, print it at a 45-degree angle, as just a very basic baseline, and then I build supports. I have never learned much about the various theories and techniques to do extra good on printing. So yeah, I just pray that it comes out and I don't have to do it again and again.
Yeah. Follow the directions, I guess, and then see.
Yep. And I think I did mention in that video that I did have to print him a few times before it came out, just because I was having some issues with my printer. Again, most likely user error.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why I like working with my mold makers to do the prints and just mold everything into metal or plastic or whatnot. I'm pretty amazed, though, about all the things people are able to print, and they seem to make it look so easy because it's not penetrable, but it's definitely a skill in its own right.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a whole endless hobby that's changing constantly, too.
That's right. All right, question from the comments. Gear Laden Lad, is there any way to renew green stuff once it's old and hardened? So, if you are talking about once you've mixed it and it's green, no, that's done. It's cured.
Plastic now.
It's plastic now. You're not going back. Not going back from there. Now, if you're talking about when you're still in the two parts, and I'm not sure if anybody saw, Drew Williams did a great video on his Patreon. He might have posted it elsewhere, where he discussed the trials he was going through getting a good batch of green stuff and talking about what to look for. It's also hard to come back and reconstitute that if you do have one that's really, really old and bad. The closest I have come and success I've had is I did have some success putting some rubbing alcohol on it. That seemed to break down whatever scaling or film seemed. But if it's built up enough that it's really penetrating deeper into the material, then yeah, I don't think there's a lot that you can do with it. The best thing you can do with your green stuff, if you want it to last long, is to put it in a Ziploc bag or some sort of mostly airtight container and put it in your freezer and let it sit there. When you're ready to use it, pull it out. You can use it within a few hours, but ideally you should let it thaw for 24 hours just to make sure there's no moisture kind of mixing in, clinging to the green stuff. But if you do that, if you keep it frozen until you need it, it will last you a long, long, long time. I will say this though, I sculpt, but I go in starts and stops. And this putty here, this is actually somewhat fresh, but for the most part, I will put my green stuff in just these little bead jars. They're not specifically airtight, but it does keep a lot of the air off them compared to most packaging. And I have had the same material, not this specific batch, but the same material sitting here for at least a year, and it still functions and works just as good as the day I put it in there. So I'm sure it changed some, but it's quite minimal. So as long as you have it in some sort of good airtight packaging, but I still recommend just keeping out what you will use in a reasonable amount of time, because you can always pull out more. Yes, and he clarified, still unmixed yellow and blue. So good. Okay. Yeah, so if you do have a bad batch where you're starting to see these small particles when you tear, mix the two putties together because you're getting some skin or scaling happen, yeah, there's not a lot you can do. You obviously can still mix it together, you can still use it, but those particles they'll just basically stay as like a little yellow plastic flecks is what it usually looks like. You can try and pluck them out, and I've actually, before I realized all that, and that was what was going on, I actually sculpted some figures with that, and they're molded that, they succeeded, but it was just such a pain to sculpt with. That was the biggest issue. Oscar Mike, how long does it take to get good at this?
I'd like to know too.
Well, I can just tell you my experience. My first miniature I ever sculpted was in 2002, and then I got my first commission job in 2003, and I had sculpted one other miniature before that happened. All of the miniatures were done using green stuff. Now, I actually think my second miniature was pretty awesome, and I think I've highlighted that in one of my early sculpting archives. It was a little dwarf. There wasn't a lot of good consideration for the specific scale and everything, but the details and proportions and like cleanness of the piece was pretty good. So for me,
that's exciting.
It went pretty fast, but like I said, I had some prior experience with sculpting, but never miniatures. Just larger clay figurines, craft kind of things. Yeah, I don't know. But I felt like I had so much more to grow, and I did have so much more to grow, and I remember being very frustrated for quite some time with some of the pieces I was doing. In hindsight, they don't bother me as much, and I, appreciate them for the growth they were, and sometimes I even think they're better than I thought at the time. But it definitely takes practice, especially with green stuff. It's with any material, but if you're sculpting strictly with green stuff, it's very finicky. It takes a little bit to get used to. Have you been sculpting for long, Oscar Mike? I think a lot of it just depends on your background. So I've always been into 3D modeling and sculpting, but my drawing helped too. I studied illustration in university, and so while I wasn't a great illustrator by any means, a lot of practice with anatomy and things like that, I was able to translate. That's actually, I think, why, I don't know, sculpting just came easier to me.
Yeah.
Because I felt like it was easier to make the right forms in 3D because it was so much more obvious when they were wrong. With drawing, it's all about making it look like it's the thing.
Yeah,
in 3D,
you're doing a magic trick more so with drawing.
Exactly. With 3D, you have to have that shape, and you look at it from all these angles, and you can see where it's right and wrong, and
yeah, that pesky third dimension.
The kids are yelling in the other room. All right, I'm gonna do this. Let's do another question. So I only had 2 from the comments recently, so I wanted to get through these because I have a surprise. So this one's actually a little more than 5 days old. So thanks for your patience. I meant to message Thomas Anonymous that I would be answering it on here. So, all right, good info. Again, he's talking, and this is in response to my Farmer Gamut sculpting video. I'm a complete newbie, learning to sculpt digitally on Blender, and it's been a bit confusing figuring out how the workflow should work for minis in particular. A lot of video tutorials show you how to create a model, but those are aimed at animation games purposes, so they make T-pose first and pose it later.
Right.
So it's like you got to make a whole posable model before even adding any features. Seems like a lot of unnecessary rigmarole when you could just block out block it out in the desired pose from the start. The posing functions always make a mess too. So here's the question. How do reference images work in the process? Do you draw a character reference with front and side views, etc., or just work off a single image? Well, piggybacking off of the comment about the video game industry, and Matt, I know you can because I know you're aware of this. A lot of, especially with 3D, most people are getting full turnarounds because you've got the concept artist, and then you have a separate person usually that's doing the 3D. And usually that person's job is just to execute. They're not typically being given a lot of freedom and agency.
Right. More of a technician, probably. It depends on what in what context you're doing it, right? It's obviously you can do it all soup to nuts if you're
which is what we're doing, which is what's which is what's cool. And so for myself, I have worked from concept art many times. And when I do, I don't need multiple drawings. I just need one. And I don't even need it to be in the pose. I just need to understand, have a general sense of what it looks like. Obviously, if there is some specific detail on the back, if I'm being provided concept artwork, then they have to. The artist has to provide that, or I'm just going to have to. I'll make something up.
Yeah.
For me specifically, I do prefer to have a drawing before I go into sculpting. Even when I'm doing my own figure, all for myself, I'll sketch something, and it's usually pretty loose. I usually don't. It doesn't have to be anything super fancy. And I'll
sweat super details or anything.
At most, I'll do 2 drawings. So I might do several as I'm just figuring it out. But once I kind of get to one that I figured out, I'll sometimes end up with 2 different ones. The first one is the the actual drawing that shows me main details, big important information, and then the other one would be just a rough thumbnail of a pose. And that's because I find it easier sometimes to draw a figure in a pose or in a shape that is that I'm used to drawing, very stock. And also, if you're trying to figure out details, it's easier to come up with those and figure them out when a person's just standing there facing front, rather than trying to figure out a cool pose and then draw out all the details and figure those out and how those work. And then half the time, if you do a cool pose, you're not going to see the details anyway, so that's not useful.
Right.
Oh my gosh, I totally forgot to do this. I gotta do this now. Forgot to do my plug.
Oh.
My plug for... Alright, this is the Ultimate Quick Start Guide to Sculpting Miniatures by me. This is a baby version that I made for fun to show on the streams.
Yeah, nice.
So you can get this guide, my Ultimate Quick Start Guide to Sculpting Miniatures. Oh, there's extra pages. By joining my mailing list. Sign up for my mailing list below. And link
it's
below.
A mini sculpting guide.
It's a mini. Yeah, the Ultimate
Nice.
Quick Start Guide to the Ultimate Mini Quick Start Guide to Sculpting Miniatures. But yeah, if you click the link in the description below, sculptminisnow.com/free guide, I think it is. Click on that, say you want the download. I'll send that out to you, and you can use it to help you get started sculpting miniatures. What are you working on today, Matt?
I don't really know. The question about the concept art is interesting because I've had to actually cheat concept art before. I'm terrible. I'm so bad with stuff like that. Where I'll use Savage as an example because I just go right into producing the asset usually because I kind of know what I want. But I've had, especially when you participate in stuff like press events or whatever, like, oh, can you send us some concept art of X, Y, or Z or whatever? I'm like, it's like go back and fake a concept drawing or something, But it is mega helpful to have obviously a plan and a goal and stuff. But I think what I'm kind of doing right now is like, since I'm so new at this, I've only done one miniature before. But this guy might wind up an Argeshi Manhunter from Savage.
Oh, nice.
So he's one of the, that game's version of like a stormtrooper, essentially. The cannon fodder. Just a dude with a club with some armor, some light armor, a helmet. So I'm just working on form really, and messing with the material, getting used to it a little more. But that will probably be what I'm gonna wind up with here eventually. Just an angry man with a helmet and a club, with a lot of muscles showing.
All right, Oscar Mike said, seems like there's a lot of overlap with perspective drawing and sculpting. I think that's true. I think that they can both inform each other.
Any good grasp of 3D space, I think, is going to help a lot.
It is funny. I mentioned earlier how drawing, you're kind of making something look like something. It's not necessarily. You're tricking. That's actually one. Even though I made the claim that when you're sculpting miniatures, it can only be what it can be. But there is still plenty of opportunity with miniatures specifically. I guess you can do this with any sculpture, but with the small figures that these are, you actually do enter into that world a little bit of trying to fake it and make it look like that. Not so much on the large, but smaller details, like things you can, things you can do with the face, chainmail, certain other details where you just have to apply the textures in such a way that the eye reads it as a thing. But if you really zoom in, you're like, ugh.
Yeah, that's a mess. I don't even know what that is.
Yeah.
And that's the case too with like a lot of this has given me a little bit of grace, is going back and looking at a lot of the older minis, older Citadel stuff from like the 80s and Ralpartha or whatever. It's like, oh, they did what I did here. Or whatever.
Yeah, I really
his hand is also kind of confusing.
Yeah. It's really nice looking at those older figures because, and man, they just smashed them out so fast. It's incredible.
Yeah, production rate is like a dying art, I think, across a lot of disciplines, whether it's comics or whatever. Certainly my case with video games, but like you go and look at like the rate those guys were churning out like arcade games and stuff.
Oh yeah.
Freaking comics every month, so several pages a week on those kinds of schedules.
I wonder if some of it's just because we have so many more tools, whether it's video games or sculpting. We can get away with a lot more. There's different materials, different ways to mold,
right?
Sorts of tools to code. You can push things a lot farther.
Yeah, the options are endless now. You're not limited, which is good and bad.
I really hope can make this figure something that I care about, because I got to tell you right now, I am not feeling it. But it's in that stage, that ugly utilitarian stage where you just need to get material on it, then you can start giving it some more specific or useful form.
Pose is cool.
Thanks.
You got such a good sense of like weight and motion.
Yeah, I'm excited to get the mace in here. I need to find that. I have it around somewhere. Okay, let's see what we got. Oh, Scott Frenchick. Hey, man, how's it going? He says, your hand drawing is very good, too. Thank you. Have you sculpted anything recently? Are you sculpting still these days, Scott? Scott and I used to hang out at the Gen Con Sculptors meeting every year.
Oh, cool. I've never been to Gen Con.
Oscar Mike says, now make an even miniature version of the guide and give it to your mini.
Little guy holding it.
That's a funny idea.
Yeah. That'd be a good screenshot or a good, little marketing photo.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So it's time to unveil the next question. So I had fun doing all these questions last time, but I wanted to aggregate more just to have some more in the backlog in case I needed more things to talk about. So I was just looking through the comments and I realized that when I first started my YouTube channel, I just put some videos up there. I didn't get any notifications when comments came in. I didn't even think that anybody would comment. I just put them up there because why did I do that? I think I did it mainly as a marketing tool for that first Kickstarter. And then it wasn't until months or maybe even a year later that I realized how many views they were getting and that people were actually interacting with them. But because it had been so long, I never responded to everybody, and I forgot about that. So when I went on there, I found tons of questions that I never answered, at least directly. So here's the first one.
Neat.
It's from 12 years ago.
Oh, man.
So let's go back. So hopefully these people are still around. This question was on one of my earliest videos, the Effigy Miniatures Sculpting the Havoc, Sculpting the Sci-Fi Hacker. This is before they had the term Havoc Protocol. This is from part 9. So which material do you use for sculpting? This gray stuff seems to be more flexible to work with than green stuff. So in this video, this question, I was sculpting with Procreate for that figure. And yeah, I do think I do usually prefer it over green stuff. However, I definitely these days prefer to do the majority of my sculpting with clay. I use green stuff as a material that will help it stick to the armature, and then for final finishing touches. But when I was doing straight putty, I much preferred to use Procreate. And I've gone over this in several of the videos, but it just has some properties that are a little bit nicer. It's still definitely a putty, so you have to deal with some of that. But it does have some aspects that felt a little bit more clay-like, less bubblegum-like, which green stuff is definitely on the bubblegum side of things. Okay. Ooh, so Scott has not been sculpting too much, he said, but trying to get back into it, messing around with digital. All right.
Scott, so you have a YouTube channel?
I don't know. Scott, do you have a YouTube channel? I don't think you do.
A place to look at his things?
Scott will have to tell us. I know he's had several things released and with different companies and such, but I don't remember if you had your own website or anything like that for your pieces. Back when we would hang out, it was before all that stuff. I think, Facebook was kind of barely a concern even.
Right.
Nope. Scott, I do have some of Scott's miniatures. that he gave me a long time ago.
Cool.
I won't pull them out this time. Maybe I can bring them out on the next stream. Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. Happy to answer them. How do you do tiny details like fingers or eyes and the mouth? So I'll start with the eyes and the mouth because those really are what I was talking about earlier. Those are best done as a trick as far as I'm concerned, rather than trying to painstakingly sculpt it. I mean, you can, for sure, but it's such a small area with such fine, small details. So the way I start with either mouth or eyes is I actually use this tool, this scalpel here. And for eyes, I actually cut two little V's that with the top openings, sideways V's with the top openings facing each other. So I'll kind of stab in like this and like this. I'll turn the tool around. I'll stab it in like this and like this. And what that does is it actually creates some depressions and it makes it look like there's a ball. Then I can do it. You can do a little bit of refinement with a fine needle tool like this to kind of pluck and give a little bit more dimension, but you can get a long way just with that. And then the mouth itself is very similar as well. I'll just do a line, a kind of a very wide upside down V, unless I'm trying to make the person smile, but there's a resting face. Just kind of poke in this way, and there's a basic mouth. It's more complicated if you're trying to have a wild expression or have it open. Then you're definitely getting more into making it look like the right thing, and there's a lot more manipulation of the material going on. But you can get away with a lot, just those couple little adjustments. Hands, there's some similarities there too. I like to get a big form built up, and I tend to try and do a work on the palm, so the back and the inside, kind of get that shape in place first. And you can see here with this armature, I've squished the hand like this to help give more of a actual armature platform to build everything on. And once I have that, then I will put on an additional blob of clay to kind of be the fingers, and then a third smaller little tube for the thumb. But for the fingers, you get everything smoothed in, and it's very important to look at the hand in its full shape that you're trying to make it. So if you're doing a fist, you want to get, pretend the thumb isn't here, but you want to get everything else sculpted into shape without any lines or divisions of the fingers, but you want to get this plane and try and get some of those angles, maybe define the knuckles, get this plane of these fingers, so on. Then when you have that shape down and you create interesting little divots, that's when you can start to cut the fingers in. If you do that, you can do it early. You can have more of a blobby hand, cut your fingers, but you'll end up having to push it around, getting it into a nice shape anyways, and then you'll have to recut them. And if you're using putty or even clay and you've already cut that and it's too deep, or you have trouble cleaning it up or it's in the wrong spot, then the fact that you've had to mush and smush everything around can be hard to kind of clean those up and put in a nice clean new line. And that's really a good tenet for sculpting altogether is before you put details in, get everything as smooth as possible and get everything into a good basic shape first. Save a lot of time and helps you see if your forms are good before you spend a lot of time putting in details that you might not need or have to get rid of.
I'm noticing that I'm doing that a lot. Like I'm jumping the gun with like, oh man, I want to sculpt his abs.
Yeah.
Or something. There's mega pecs in.
Yeah. And it's easier. It's really tempting to do that when you're with putty, because putty lends itself to sculpting that way, but you can also fall into that trap with clay too, especially because that's the biggest hurdle with clay is kind of keeping yourself moving. It's very tempting to just
stop and zone
you have as much time as you want, so just keep going, just keep noodling on that thing. Oh, I had some more green stuff here. I just realized. I'll make some more. I need some more anyways. So I did touch on this. So this is a figure I started a long time ago. There's a pre-cast armature that this figure is based on. I didn't make a wire armature like I typically do. And I was using this figure as a putty catcher. And what that is it's an extra miniature that you have started that you only sculpt on when you have extra putty, so you don't waste it. I was always pretty terrible at that. If I ever did a putty catcher, the most I would do would use the putty to bulk forms. I was never good about, once it came to detail, I didn't want to just randomly do that. I always worked better staying focused on a specific miniature, which is another reason why I have gravitated towards polyclay. It gives me because I can keep going, keep working and pushing. You don't have to sit and wait for putty to cure, right, which lends itself to working on multiple things. So, but I decided I wasn't going to finish this character in putty, so I'm going ahead and adding this thin layer of green stuff on the existing materials, and then putting a little bit of the polyclay on top, and that will allow me to be able to add more polyclay and finish this figure that way. Right. Let's go ahead and get some on his arms finally. I have been getting back on getting busy with sculpting again. I've been on a bit of a hiatus, focusing on earlier in the year getting everything ready for the Goblin Menace demo, and then just kind of got burnt out after all that, and so I hadn't done much. But I'm working on a new project. It's a quick project, a smaller project that I wanted to get done before I dive back deep into the Goblin Menace, because I know once I start that, it's going to take a lot more time, and I'm not going to have time for anything else. And that is a small expansion to my Havoc Protocol SciFi Miniatures line. And so I've done a couple. I'm almost finished with a figure for that.
Too.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Matt's seen those. I've been mostly working on setup, and so I'm getting the first one done now. But it's been really fun to do that. I haven't done... when was the last time I did a sci-fi miniature? Unless I count my son's, he had me do this dwarf with a cyborg arm and a giant gun. And that would have been probably 6 years ago now. That might have been the last thing that I did sci-fi, and before that, it was when I worked for MegaCon Games and was doing Mercs. Pretty crazy. Felt like for a long time all I was doing was sci-fi, and then it turned to fantasy for anything personal, and obviously for my other work at MegaCon. Speaking of which, I don't know if anybody backed the Myth Journeyman Kickstarter. Feels like ages ago. But they have, the company that bought the property from MegaCon has just finished or was in the process of final fulfillment of all the miniatures. And I got my set of the stretch goal miniatures. And it was really, really cool to be able to see all these figures again, many of which I sculpted. I did not sculpt all of the ones in that set that's coming out, but I did sculpt a lot. And some of them I forgot I did. So that was exciting to now have a a record and see that blast from a past. So.
Yeah, cool.
All right, Oscar Mike asks, do you ever cast your miniatures when you are done, such as in aluminum? Ooh, I have the only time. So all my figures are that I make for myself. You know, I do get them molded, and they're cast in pewter, lead-free pewter alloy, and that's what I make and sell in my store. And a lot of what I've done for clients has been that same material. Had a few other things as well. The only time I have had something cast in a non, miniature game material, standard stuff, is I do have 2 bronze figures of these hard suit astronaut figures that I did for, I believe his name was David Pinnock. That was very early on in my career, and I think he was having everything mastered in bronze. I think because he wanted them to basically be impervious if he ever wanted again, and he had extras, and he gave me some, so that was pretty cool. Hey, Ed. Yes, so these figures will eventually go into molds. I don't have any specific plans for this figure, but I was actually just talking about this with my wife.
Oh, is that Mark? MED?
Wait.
I think that's Mark.
Hey, Mark. Did we just out him?
Oh, maybe I doxed him.
Yeah.
Come to the Tom Mason Mini Sculpting Super Show to get doxed.
Yeah, I have trouble. Anything that I sculpt, or I'm sorry, if I'm going to sculpt something in my head, I'm always thinking it's got to go in a mold. Like I can't fathom sculpting something that I won't put out there. It feels like a waste, which isn't bad, but it's also can sometimes limit you because then, especially when you're learning, the stuff we create isn't always worthy of molding, when you're just trying to figure things out. So got to be careful that you don't let it get that thought that it's got to be good enough to produce get in the way, especially when you're in those early learning stages. And I do have a lot of stuff, especially early on. I mentioned that I did get a gig, did get sculpting gigs very early on. I was very fortunate with that. And I was doing work, but I have plenty of figures. They're not super far along, but ones that I started that I just knew weren't working, or I just wasn't interested in working on them anymore, and so I set them aside. And I actually still have them all in a box. I think I always had it in mind that if I didn't know what else to do or didn't have anything else to do, I could always just pull one of those out and finish it. But that's never come up.
Oh, hi, Mark.
Oh, Oscar Mike. The intro on the right looks like that one last of me with the big guy punching. I don't know that one. Do I know that one?
I don't know. Big Punchin' Man meme. Don't know.
Yeah. Hey, thanks, Jay. All right. Do you think there is a market for this thing area for one-of-a-kind miniatures? Well, I mean, yeah, for sure. I think it's a smaller market, and it depends on what you're trying to do. Like if you're trying to make a living at it, then you're going to probably want to be charging quite a lot. But I do from time to time get people who reach out to me and want want to do one-off commissions just for themselves. I typically don't take those. I have done them in the past, but part of it goes back to this idea that it's weird of me to think I'm going to sculpt this thing and only this one person gets to have it. Like, I want everybody to be able to have this cool miniature that I made.
Yeah.
And another part of that too is, when you do that work for that one person, it might seem like I would want to or should charge the same as I would charge a company, but I'm inclined to want to charge more because you'll do this one figure for that one person and nobody else will ever see it. And so, when you do a piece for Reaper or another well-known company, lots of other people see it, and so it's easier to get more work.
It's usually almost like super old school patronage, right?
Exactly. And so, so I don't know. There's different ways you can go about it, and a lot of it just is going to come down to how you feel about it and what you're willing or interested in doing. If you love the idea of sculpting one-offs, for specific collectors,
every miniature is an art piece, basically. Yeah.
Then that I think is very worth your time. I mean, that's why. I a lot of how I work is purely because that's how I prefer. I find more enjoyment, doing it slow and methodically and working on my own stuff, rather than hustling for other people all the time. All right. Do you ever paint your own miniatures and go to those painting contests? Ooh, I have never. So I do paint my own miniatures. I didn't for a long time. I used to kind of be, I guess, I don't know if, I always said to myself that I'm sick of my miniature. I was staring at them forever. I'm sculpting it, and then you want to do the next thing. But when I went in and started to paint a bunch of my more recent stuff, I think more of it was that I just wasn't specifically excited about those figures. I didn't want to paint those. Because when I'm painting a miniature, I'm getting, the same thrill of sculpting and kind of creating this world. And usually when I'm getting into wanting to paint, I want to paint something I'm really jazzed about. And usually I'm jazzed about this new miniature I bought that somebody else sculpted. But I have really enjoyed painting my own miniatures recently. And I think part of that's because I'm much more proud of the designs, or they're fitting into the kinds of miniatures I like to paint more. And I think for a time, especially with the Mercs miniatures, I loved the Mercs miniatures so much. Loved sculpting them. They're so dynamic. But I hated painting them, and I hate painting miniatures like them with so much detail. It's so challenging for me and just wasn't fun. So as I've started to create these more just right detailed figures, I'll put it that way. It's been a lot easier for me to go that route. But I've never entered any of my own painted pieces that I also sculpted in a contest. I have entered a couple contests though. I think last one I remember that was painting was forever ago at Pentacon, and it was a conversion of a Heresy Miniatures figure, Bortus the Barbarian. I just sculpted some extra armor on him and painted him. And I remember it was in college, explaining to my art teacher where I was kind of behind on some other stuff, and I was trying to sell him on the idea that, well, I'm getting into the miniatures industry, so this is good. I mean, I need to be doing this.
What do you say?
I think he was just reminding me that, well, you still need to do your work. And he was right. Because, if I did, maybe I would be an illustrator now. But I didn't. I just kept farting around with miniatures. Okay, what else we got going on in the chat? Let's see. Typical DM. It sucks to have one boss too, because you have to meet one person's expectations. Yep. Are your miniatures on Reaper Mini? Yes, I have. If you search Tom Mason, you should see most of my miniatures that are on there. Every now and then, there's I think a couple still that were mistagged as like John Mason or Trey Mason or just they mix sculpt. I don't think I ever had one that was like just totally miscredited. It was just somebody got confused when they were typing in the names. But the majority of them are on there, and their Fig Finder is so great, so it's very easy to find stuff. But
it's got some awesome barbarians on there.
Yeah, those were my most recent figures I did for them. It was last year. It was about a year ago at this time that I actually sculpted them. But some of them were the free giveaway miniatures recently. Male and female barbarian, Hyborian barbarian, and then a Hyborian evil wizard or sorcerer. Those were a lot of fun. But the first thing I ever sculpted for them was a dwarf. And then I did dwarves for a long time. I used to love doing dwarves.
Which was the
I
first
still like dwarves a lot.
Yeah.
Yep. I have never sculpted a dwarf for myself, though. I need to. My friend Brian is always pestering me to do it as well. He's a huge dwarf miniature collector, and I'll get to it eventually.
What was the first dwarf you did for them?
It was either called a dwarf sapper or a dwarf miner. It's a guy that's kind of just standing there, kind of like he's waiting to go on his shift. He's got a cool little helmet slash like face guard helmet slash miner's cap, and I say pickaxe, but it's more axe than pick. But
I think I know that. Yeah, I know the one.
Yeah,
it's like axe and pickaxe on either end.
Yeah. And those are still that one, and then there was a sergeant to go along with that group. It was for their warlord line. Are still some of my favorite miniatures of all time. But I remember I was working on finishing that first one at ReaperCon. I got to go to the Artist Con, and I remember Ron. He's so gracious and whatnot, but he was kind of proud of me, like, what are you doing? What's taking so long? Like, you just got these ribbons to put on, right? To be fair, it was taking me forever, but I really feel like while I could execute and make a figure look good, it took me forever to kind of get comfortable with the material and get to a point where I could actually like start sculpting at any sort of feasible pace. Do I prefer hand sculpting or 3D? I've been thinking about that a lot recently. I'll get back to Jake's question in a second. I just noticed that, but I've been thinking about that a lot recently because if you didn't know, I flip back and forth. I'm doing a lot of digital, but I obviously do traditional. Here I am right now, and I have some plans to do more, which has been coming out of some just thoughts on fulfillment and what I'm actually enjoying. There's a lot of positive things about digital, and I'm finding, here's what it comes down to. I'm finding if I'm doing something in more of a strict production or commercial environment, I tend to lean towards wanting to do it digital because it affords me a lot of time-saving things, especially if I'm going to sculpt multiples of a similar thing. It's just way easier to reuse elements, repurpose things. But it takes a little more for me to get it to feel as organic the way I'm used to with digital. And it feels very mechanical. I have to be, I really like how that Farmer Gamut figure came out. And part of the main reason for that is that I was sculpting it effectively traditionally, and I felt so much more free. But it is very easy for me to fall into kind of a mechanical mindset, a technical mindset, which I'm good at, but I don't enjoy it as much. All right, Jake, what's Jake say? I have yet to succeed as a fine artist, but I have this love of gaming I want to share in similar ways. Yep, I too am not making it as a fine artist. I have a day job. But that is one of the great things about any art, but this one especially is really a great, you can do a lot with it as a side endeavor. And I always tell this I've told this to my wife and friends that I'll keep doing this until I, am either able to do it or I get to retirement age. And the reason why I'm going to keep up with it now is because I don't want to get to that age and finally get things started. I want to at least have the ball rolling. All right, I actually almost have this guy skinned. So whenever I'm skinning a figure, prepping a miniature to be sculpted with the full detail, I do this thin layer polyclay over everything so that I can start adding clay and it will stick wherever I need it to. But I always leave the hands undone. I used to get those covered too and kind of in place, but I found that they end up getting squished, or I maybe want to manipulate them more. And so I found it easier usually just to leave it at the end. So I'll focus on most of the body. It gives me a couple spots to kind of brace if I feel like I need to brace. And while this guy is larger, so there's a good chance I'll do his hands completely with polyclay. On smaller figures, I've personally found it easier to just cook this whole thing and then finish the hands with putty afterwards. Because you can generally sculpt things a little finer when you're using putty because you don't have to have any sort of material underneath staging what's going on. I haven't checked the time. I have no idea how long we've been doing this. Oh.
Be probably 8:04 for you.
Yep. All right. So I am going to. We'll go for definitely another 5, maybe 10 minutes here. Let's see if there's any other questions, and I'd like to get one more of these decade-old questions out of the way.
Yeah.
All right. But first, let's see what's in the chat here. Jake says, I love your dwarves. I didn't realize how many of your figures I had until I saw your vid on the Sergeant. Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, man, I love those figures. I had such a blast. I did some more Dwarfs for Reaper in recent times. If anybody hasn't seen the Dwarf King's Tomb, I think it's called, set, Reaper Bone set, that was a lot of fun.
Yeah,
that really stretched me doing all the terrain. Yeah. All right. Ermin says, I've just started and I'm using Fimo Soft over armature. It does stick, but I find it difficult to smooth the surface because the whole part tend to move. Do you encounter this issue on your journey? Yes, 100%. The very first polyclay figure I did was I sculpted I was trying to do it polyclay, and I had started with the body, the torso, shoulders, and kind of down the thighs, and I sort of got it to stick. I got it to stick enough. This was also with Fimo Soft, but it was straight. It was polyclay on the armature. There was no epoxy helping it stick and fuse together. And I got it to stick, but I knew that if I kept going, that this thing was just going to fall apart. So for the head and the shoulders and the arms, and then from the knees down, that was all Procreate putty, and that helped hold it together barely. And I got it to baked it, let it cure, got it to my mold maker, and thank heavens for them. They're so good. They were able to get a fine cast out of it, but everything that was polyclay just shattered, disintegrated into nothing. Like there wasn't even like big chunks; it just all broke apart.
Heartbreak.
Yep. Part of that was that it was Fimo soft, and it was while they were using good rubbers, there wasn't the quite as modern ones that were being used now, low temp rubbers. But the other reason was that it wasn't adhered or fused, so it was moving and shifting as it was being molded a little bit. So it broke down. So yeah, that's why I teach this technique here, where you have your armature wire and you put a thin layer of green stuff putty or some sort of epoxy putty, and then work the Fimo over it. The only polyclay I've used where you don't have to do this, and I haven't done it on a larger figure, but I know the creator has done it on many figures, and I've done it successfully on figures, is bees putty. That you can actually mix it into a little slurry with some turpentine. You can paint that onto your armature, and then when that all evaporates and hardens, it creates a surface that your polyclay can actually stick to, and it's not cured, but it's just enough, and it's just embedded enough on the wire that it tends to stick. You just have to be a little careful, but once you get enough on there and enough built up, it tends to stay pretty well put. All right. Typical DM. I am trying to make an entire line of products that is exclusively sculpted by hand, but I certainly see the drawbacks of the medium. That's why I asked. That's a good point. I mean, if you go to craft fairs, I mean, everybody's making it by hand, especially, the ceramic artists. I think the key, though, is to, figure out what's your clientele, right? Are you selling to somebody who's going to pay a lot for a unique sculpture, or are you going for volume where the things you're creating don't take you, 40 hours at a time? You can't be selling that for $20.
Yeah. It's like a painting, right?
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's do one of these 10-year-olds. So this one is also from 12 years ago. This is from Minutes on the Sun, which is one of my earliest subscribers, and he actually has a YouTube channel. He started to post again recently. I need to check out and see what he's doing these days. Minutes on the Sun. Yep. And this is from part 2 of the Sculpting the Sci-Fi Hacker. What gauge wire is the armature made with? So again, talking about this figure specifically, but this figure I use the same gauge for everything, and I use in general, I've experimented with some other things, but in general I'm using a 24 gauge galvanized steel wire.
First one I did was with a paper clip.
Paperclip works too. Paper clips do snap pretty easily if you work them too hard. If you're not sure where you're going with the pose and armature, if you're going back and forth,
sure,
they will snap.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
But if you but actually they're actually really good if you know where you need it to be and you put it there and you don't mess with it, because they stay very rigid. It's very hard.
Have you used paperclip before?
I have not.
Oh, okay.
I have not, but I have played with it.
Yeah.
I've done a lot of brass wire as well, which is similar. It has a similar breaking point where it's flexible, but if you mess around with it too much, it snaps. The galvanized, again, all wire will, right? But the galvanized stuff, you get a lot more play. But that's another reason why I started doing sketches, though, too, because I just found that I could kind of work things out quicker and easier, and then I wouldn't accidentally break my armature as I was like, is this right?
Mark brought this over.
I look at it on the other screen.
Oops.
Yes.
Not even holding it well. There we go. There's a little better. There's one of Tom's dwarves on Reaper.
I'm looking on my... Oh, I actually have one here. So these are some of the barbarians. This is a test print I did when I was sculpting this, because up until this figure, I had never sculpted a human digitally. So I did it, and then I did a quick test print just to see like if everything was looking good and proportioned well. So I really like how that turned out. And then this is an actual casting from Reaper. They were giving this away at the Paint and Take at Adepticon. So a lady barbarian.
And there's this.
And I need to get it. Yeah.
It's always challenging to hold these up to a camera.
Yeah.
There's Kel.
Kel. Oh yeah. So Kel is from Matt's game Savage, Shard of Gosen, which still. I'll just share this story really quick. Matt and I came to know each other because we were both just fans of each other's work, and we both reached out independently at different times for different reasons. And then I think it's when you were posting about Lord Breakers when I finally was like, I gotta be friends with this guy.
Yeah.
We started hanging out.
Yeah, and I've been watching your sculpting videos for quite some time. So I'd always wanted to do this.
Oh, typical DM is clarifying sculpting originals by hand, but casting the pieces for. Yeah, totally. That's totally doable. No, I've seen plenty of people saying with videos like, "This is the best way. This is the right way." The only thing I'll say to that is, if you want to be a freelance sculptor, nowadays most people kind of assume or expect you to be a digital sculptor. But if you're good enough, if you have the right thing, then they can and still will work with you traditionally. And if it's all for you, I mean, you should be doing it the way that works best for you. Actually,
if they want to digitize it, it's pretty easy to do these days.
Yeah,
from
nowadays,
traditional to a and for relatively cheap too. I've seen who are those guys? They're not Fortress, but they're. We were talking
about this the other day.
Yeah, they have a scanner and a scanner solution there that doesn't cost that much, surprisingly. Like from what you would probably get out of it, like it's relatively cheap to do. But anyway, sorry, go ahead.
No, no. I was just thinking about my fellow sculptors over the years. Some of them that I've met. Some of them went digital and they loved it. Some of them went digital because they felt like they had to. And I was always like, man, I mean, if you're doing it and it's working, like, unless you have a specific reason to change, like, just keep doing it digitally. Your stuff's awesome.
Yeah.
Just
cool mini is a cool mini.
You don't want to get caught in that trap of like feeling like you have to.
Yeah, like it's not real or something.
Yeah, this is funny though. I've done several traditional recently, but it's been a while since I've done a larger figure. So this should go a little faster. For whatever reason, I'm always like extra deliberate on this initial skinning stage, and then when everything's on there, I just start blobbing stuff on. Probably doesn't help that I'm talking half the time. Yeah, Scott, I'll see if we can find what that was and post that up. All right, I'll do one more question from the archives. This one, it's only 11 years ago now. Catching up in modern times. So 2013, man. This is from part 12, man. And back in the day when I first posted these, I think I couldn't do more than 10 minutes or more than 8 minutes, something like that. So I had to break the videos up a ton. All right, question from Eric Frankhouse. Is that a brush or a rubber sculpting tool you're using to smooth? So I was talking about this tool here. In this video, I had the gray tip one. This is it's sort of both, but it's a rubber sculpting tool, but in some ways is a little more like a brush, but definitely a sculpting tool. This is called a color shaper. Actually, sorry, this one is actually called a clay shaper. Interesting. For a while, this size and this type was actually called color shaper, and there were bigger, harder ones, but it could be the black tips are now called clay shapers. Clay shaper is obviously a better name for the tool because that's what we're using it for. But yeah, these are great. I use them whether I'm doing putty or polyclay, but it's especially useful with putty because it's a silicone tip and it won't stick, at least not easily, to anything or to the epoxy. You do have to be careful though when you do it on polyclay because where it won't stick to this, it actually drags more, which is why I like to use it, because sometimes when you're using a metal tool, it's the reverse. So the metal tool glides super easily over polyclay but sticks to putty, and this glides over putty but has a tendency to catch.
Yeah, this is pulling a lot.
Yeah, I like to use that though. Sometimes if you want to grab and move something, it's a little easier. And then I like how I can create these like little texture planes. It's a bit of my style there. Just kind of letting there be a little bit of faceting from time to time on the piece. So, all right. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up. Thanks for joining me, Matt. Appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you, man.
Time. And thank you to everybody who has been joining and watching. And actually, before I go, I want to answer one last question. Somebody, SK Athalish, posted this. It's going to be past their bedtime when the stream is going on. So let's see. And this question. Or sorry, a statement. Here we go. It's 2:00 in the morning where I live, so I am asleep while you're streaming. Just started the sculpting. Wanted to do with a gnome, but it's hard to go with the flow. Should I use a reference sketch? In my opinion, yeah. I think it's very helpful to have a reference sketch because it ties you down, it grounds you, gives you something to guide, and that way you're not having to figure it all out. But I know people who prefer to work and develop right on the piece. So if you're that kind of person and you feel like the sketch is just slowing you down, don't worry about it. But for me, it speeds me up, and and I get enjoyment out of the sketch part too. So yeah, but I would definitely try it because reference is always a good thing. Tend to just sculpt what's in our head otherwise, and sometimes what you have in your head isn't very deep. So, all right. Well, now we'll officially say goodbye. Thanks everybody for joining, and see you next time. But until then, keep sculpting.